All right, let's get right into it. We're talking about one of the biggest, most talked about document dumps in a long, long time, the Epstein files. So, where do you even start with a story this massive? Well, how about with this number? 3.5 million. That's how many pages the Department of Justice just dropped for the world to see. I mean, this is a mountain of information that's been locked away under seal for years. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to break down how these files even got unsealed in the first place. We'll look at the anatomy of Epstein's network, like how it actually worked. Of course, we'll get to the names in those files. Then we'll explore how the justice system seems to have been put on trial itself. And finally, we'll cover the global political fallout that's happening right now. So you're probably asking the big question, right? What's really inside all these pages? And the answer isn't simple. It's not just a list. It's this incredibly complex web of power, abuse, and, frankly, a massive failure of our institutions. Let's start peeling back the layers. Okay, so before we get into the what, we've got to understand the how. How did millions of pages of sealed court documents end up online for everyone to see? It's a long story, but it really all starts with one person's incredible fight for justice.
And believe me, it was a legal marathon. It all kicked off back in 2015. Virginia Giuffre files this defamation suit against Ghislaine Maxwell, and that lawsuit generates this huge trove of records. The case settles, right? But the documents, they get locked up, put under a protective order. For years, they just sit there. It took a ton of legal challenges, mostly from news organizations, to get a judge in 2023 to finally say, okay, let's start unsealing some of these names. But the real game changer, the thing that blew the doors wide open, came straight from Congress.
Yeah, that final push was the Epstein Files Transparency Act. This wasn't some partisan squabble. It was a bipartisan law that basically left the government with no choice. It mandated, forced them to publish everything. We're talking all unclassified records, emails, flight logs, interview notes, the whole shebang connected to Epstein and Maxwell. And it all came to a head on January 30th, 2026. That's the day the DOJ put out an official letter basically saying, okay, we've done it. We've complied with the act. They released that final batch of documents, and just like that, the total number of pages available to the public hit that staggering 3.5 million mark. All right, so the files are out. The floodgates are open. Now, what do they actually tell us about how this whole horrific operation worked? Well, they paint a picture of a system that was shockingly sophisticated and deeply predatory. The files make it crystal clear that this wasn't a one-man show. There was an inner circle, a whole team that made this abuse possible. You have Ghislaine Maxwell, of course, named as the main recruiter and confidant. Then there's Sarah Kellen, who was handling the schedules, the logistics. You even have staff like the estate manager, Juan Alessi, who saw what was going on day in and day out. And it went international, with people like model scout Jean-Luc Brunel, who was accused of finding and supplying women on a truly massive scale. And the way they recruited victims, it's just chillingly systematic. The files lay it out like a playbook, this kind of pyramid of abuse. Step one was all about deception. Approaching young women with these fake promises, you could be a Victoria's Secret model, or offering jobs as massages. Step two was the exploitation, where they'd be forced into sexual acts, always under the guise of giving massages. And then, the most twisted part, step three, expansion. They would actually pay the victims cash, like $200 a pop, to recruit their own friends and classmates into the same nightmare.
And if you want to understand how evil that system was, just listen to this. This is a direct quote from grand jury testimony from a woman who was pulled into this at just 16 years old. She says, "For every girl that I brought to the table, he would give me $200. It just cuts you to the bone." By turning victims into recruiters, this peer-to-peer method made the whole grooming process almost invisible from the outside.
Okay, let's get to the part everyone's been talking about, the names, the big, powerful names in these files. But before we dive in, I have to say this, and it is so important. Context is everything. How a name shows up and why is the whole story. So let's look at the two former presidents mentioned, Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. The files mention them in pretty different contexts. Bill Clinton's name pops up a lot, over 50 times in some of the first documents that were unsealed. We see flight logs confirming he traveled on Epstein's jet, apparently for work with his foundation. There's also a hearsay claim from one survivor, quoting something Epstein allegedly said about him. But it's important to note the unsealed files show no evidence he was ever criminally investigated. Now for Donald Trump, His mentions are mostly from way back in the late 80s and early 90s. A witness talks about a flight being diverted to one of his casinos. But Epstein's own estate manager testified that Trump never stayed overnight at the house or got a massage. And emails from later on actually show that Epstein was pretty disparaging toward Trump, suggesting that relationship had gone cold. And this network wasn't just confined to the US. I mean, it was truly global. You've got Prince Andrew, who's mentioned in direct allegations of sexual abuse. And get this, the documents show he invited Epstein to Buckingham Palace after Epstein had already been convicted in 2008. The list goes on. Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel, stayed at Epstein's New York place multiple times. Bill Richardson, a former governor, was named in a survivor's testimony, which he denied. And Alan Dershowitz, the famous lawyer, was named in testimony from both staff and a survivor. So you see, it's easy to focus on the names, but these files, they expose something much bigger. It's not just about a network of powerful people. It's about a justice system that seems to have been put on trial itself. The documents reveal this staggering story of just baffling contradictions and so many missed opportunities for real justice. And maybe the biggest bombshell in that regard, it's a 56-page draft indictment from back in the mid-2000s. Think about that. Federal investigators had drawn up a document with 30 criminal counts, including sex trafficking. This proves they had a massive case against him years and years before he was finally arrested in 2019. So you have to ask, why on earth was that indictment just shelved? Why didn't they use it? Well, the answer is the now infamous Non-Prosecution Agreement, or NPA. This was the sweetheart deal that let Epstein completely dodge all those federal charges. Instead, he pled guilty to just one minor state charge. And here's the kicker. The deal gave federal immunity not only to him, but to any of his co-conspirators who hadn't been identified yet. And that just creates this glaring contradiction, because on one hand, you have a 30-count federal indictment sitting on a shelf from 2007, but then fast forward to 2025, and the Department of Justice issues a memo, and in that memo, they say the review found, quote, no incriminating client list, and no evidence to go after anyone else. A lot of people looked at that and just couldn't square those two things. Okay, so this wasn't just about digging up the past. The release of these 3.5 million pages had immediate, real-world consequences. We're talking political shockwaves that were felt all around the world, literally overnight. I mean, just look at this. Within weeks of the files going public, prominent figures started resigning. Over in the UK, Lord Peter Mandelson, a major figure in the Labour Party, was out after his communications and alleged payments from Epstein came to light. In Slovakia, the National Security Advisor Miroslav Lajcak, he resigned just because his name was in the documents. He said he had to do it to avoid hurting his government. And it went way beyond just people losing their jobs. In Norway, the Crown Prince has had to issue a public statement of regret for ever having contact with Epstein. Some of the emails revealed these bizarre conversations about hiring former MI6 and Mossad agents to try and get frozen assets back for the Gaddafi regime in Libya. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And then you find an email from a board member of a top school in Turkey asking Epstein, a convicted sex offender, for fundraising tips in 2014. The sheer reach of his network was just staggering. So when you step back and look at the whole process, what does it add up to? Well, the Department of Justice had to sift through more than 6 million pages to get us the 3.5 million that are now public. And there are still about 200,000 pages being withheld, mostly because of things like attorney-client privilege. So here's the bottom line, the big takeaway from all of this. The Epstein files were never, ever about some simple list of names. What they really are is a map of a sprawling, complex social network that shows how power and influence can create this bubble of protection. More than anything, it's a story about elite impunity and about how our justice system failed again and again for decades. And that really leaves us with one big question, doesn't it? We have transparency now. The files are out there. But transparency isn't the same thing as accountability, not even close. So yeah, the files are public. But is this story really over?